Welcome everyone to the first John Cain Luncheon for 2024, hosted by Per Capita and our friends that we merged with at the John Cain Foundation. For those of you who may not know me, we've got some new faces here today. My name is Emma Dawson and I'm Executive Director at Per Capita. I would like to start by acknowledging that we meet today on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Thank them for their custodianship over many generations of the land on which we meet, which was never ceded. Before I start today, I do want to point out to you, it's our first meeting of 2024. If you haven't already, you can pick up our impact summary, which shows you the achievements we made in 2023. But I just want to add one verbally, which is, since we last met, the stage 3 tax cuts have been fixed. And aren't we delighted about that? I think it's 6 years that I've been banging on about that, and what the Parliament, what the Treasurer and the Cabinet have come up with is a much, much better use of that money to support people who genuinely need it in lower and middle income brackets. Those at the top still get about $4,500 a year, so I'm not sure why they're whinging. But it's also a non-inflationary package, and I think really an excellent outcome for all of us who have been lobbying for that for some time. So well done us. Our guest today is the inimitable Julian Hill MP for Bruce, a Victorian MP, friend of Per Capita's, friend of mine, and many of yours as well. And Julian's here to talk to us about his recent work. I don't know what he did to deserve this, but was asked to head up the parliamentary inquiry into Workforce Australia. It was a mammoth task, as you will be able to see from the size of the report that his committee has produced, and which I have read cover to cover, as has May Lamb on my team, who unfortunately can't be with us today. It's an important inquiry into a really critical issue if we are going to build an economy that promotes opportunity, that ensures that all Australians have the chance to fulfil their talents, to live a good life and to obtain a good, secure job. It's core Labor business, and Julian has taken it very seriously, so please welcome him to talk to you about it today.
Thanks. This is for those listening at home. No, that's all right. Hang on, I might just do that one because otherwise it shuffles and they get static. Hello everyone at home. Can I thank you for the invitation, Emma, to be here. I'll echo your acknowledgement of the traditional owners, the Wurundjeri and the Woiwurrung people. But really only just 2 acknowledgements. I look around the room and I've been moving around. There's a whole lot of my former lives colliding, from time in local government, from my time in the Victorian Public Service and around the Labor movement. So g'day to everyone who I haven't got around to yet. But really to acknowledge you, Emma, and your leadership and work, but particularly also you and May in terms of the input you had publicly and also as a confidant and sounding board throughout the what seems like 50-year-long journey to produce the report. Don't be scared. There's only 2 or 3 paragraphs I'm going to read at various points in my very, very detailed, overburdened preparation here. But it is a really weighty and serious bit of work on a serious topic. Can I also acknowledge the Honourable Brian Howe, AO, Australia's 8th Deputy Prime Minister. Of course, you're not as old as that may make you sound, because we didn't invent the office of Deputy Prime Minister till a long time after Federation, but one of the very few people in the Parliament who was a minister the entire time in the Hawke Keating Labor governments, right from 1983 to 1996, a giant reformer, a social policy reformer, despite the trolling of your first ministerial appointment being Minister for Defence Personnel, which you made a good fist of. But every time I see you, I am both pleased, warm, and also feel slightly guilty for what I did to your photocopier as a young Labor activist. So thank you. Look, what I want to do is frame a discussion and leave a good amount of time for some question and answer and feedback. The disclaimer I'll put up front is this is not government policy. This is a parliamentary committee input, broadly cross-partisan with a couple of wrinkles there, and there's no key messages except to acknowledge that everyone gets a tax cut, not just the select few. So thanks for that, Emma. The report itself now, as in the way as parliamentary reports, is with his executive government and the public service to chew on, which they're doing currently. So no hints, sorry for anyone who turned up expecting hints about where we may land, but it is being taken seriously. Look, to set the scene, this was a very peculiar inquiry. The Minister, Tony Burke, approached me and asked me to chair it and said he wanted to set up a House Select Committee soon after the election. I say peculiar for a couple of reasons. It was a wicked problem, but we had no sense of where we wanted to land, quite genuinely. We did not embark on the inquiry with a set of answers or preconceived landing points. Very old-fashioned to follow the evidence and see where you go. Australia, though, for 25 years, best part of 3 decades, has been an outlier, if you look globally, in terms of having fully marketised employment services. We're a poster child, almost a kind of a curious circus animal for the OECD and other nations that come and look and go, well, of course, at one extreme is the Australian system. That's not to say that everything about it was bad. If you look, it was actually pretty cheap and efficient at helping or pushing people close to the labour market back into work so they didn't get stuck or scarred too long. Beyond that, it's a pretty short list of things that you'd say it did really well. When we came to government, we had a natural question mark over close to $7 billion of contracts that had been signed just before caretaker period on the eve of an election. And I think an accumulated set of frustrations for members of the caucus over many terms and years, however long people had been there, about what we see in our electorate offices day to day from people who are just not supported by the system. The disclaimer, again, I'll put at the front, is there are so many truly wonderful people who work in this system and achieve small miracles, often against the odds. So none of this is a criticism of the workforce. And I'll touch on the workforce in a moment. It's an examination of the system. The other thing I'll just note is there was a very conscious choice, and I think what proved to be a wise choice by the Minister, to get a bunch of politicians to do this, as opposed to people much cleverer and much more expert than us. We could have got, professors, we could have got consultants, we could have got labour market experts. The previous reviews were well-intentioned, guided by the people who really know the system in and out. But I think for 2 reasons, and I think we've done justice to these aspects. One, there's an inherent set of questions that only politicians can answer in this. At the core of it, what is it reasonable for a society to expect people who are unemployed to do and require them to do, and what kind of help can be provided or should be provided? And second, to challenge existing orthodoxy, because much of the public service and indeed our great and the good in this sector, it's almost become like the boiled frog. We only know what we know because that's what we know. And why do we do it? Well, that's how we did it last year. So I think for those 2 reasons, they wanted a bunch of politicians to look at it. It was a genuine first principles inquiry, the first in 3 decades. We decided to read. We spent a few months reading and doing private hearings, finding the cleverest people we could. I did a coming out speech, as I call it, to the CEOs of NESA, where we threw a few rocks in the pond, provided a critique and analysis, and I think got people to realise we were deadly serious about having a fresh look at things. We did a submission guide, and then there was 12 months of sleeves rolled up work with hearings, submissions, visits, including engagement with at least 12 other nations directly through the OECD in Paris, and then some European comparators who had different systems to ours. So we took it seriously. I can say on a personal level, it was, and I see Alison and people I worked with, Julian, in the department in previous lives, it was probably the most complex piece of public policy review that I've done, and I've looked after metropolitan planning strategy, business engagement, all sorts of different things. And probably for 9 months I had a sense of personal panic and confusion because I genuinely had no idea. The more you learnt, the more confused you got about what on earth you would do. And you've always got to have a view about where you might land. It was like the elephant in the sort of wardrobe, or the monster in the wardrobe. At some point we're going to have to write a report. But I crossed the Rubicon mid last year when I concluded very clearly that not just does the system not work effectively, it actually can't work effectively in the way it's been designed because of some fundamental flaws. And I'll just highlight 2 up front. One is what I'd argue, and we argued in the report, is a flawed theory of unemployment that we've been guided by since the Howard years, which suggests that unemployment is always an individual personal failing. And that's the whole ideology that has sat around and driven the myth of the dole bludger, that anyone who is out of paid employment, there's something wrong with them and it's their fault. Completely ignores the realities of friction through the labour market in a market economy, but more fundamentally it ignores the myriad of structural barriers which confront a lot of our citizens, be that limited capacity, a lack of skills because of early life issues, fetal alcohol syndrome, all sorts of things that the individual is just not going to succeed. The most pernicious we found around the country is age discrimination, some of the most impactful conversations with people who've worked all their lives and through all of the vagaries of life are not in work now, and they can't get back into work because of structural discrimination, whether it's disability, health, and so on, or episodic mental illness, episodic health conditions. So all of these things which are part of the human condition are just not taken into account in this theory of unemployment that it's always your fault. The second flawed belief that you've got to understand right up front to make sense of where we've landed is this flawed belief that more competition will always somehow magically deliver better outcomes for vulnerable people or vulnerable consumers, if you want to use that language. That's not to say there's not a role for contestability and choice. There is. We're not recommending recreating a giant monolithic bureaucracy that does everything. Disappointing some. We got those submissions, but it's a flawed belief that the way that theories of competition and marketisation have been applied, we argue. So where we landed was that it's more than just tinkering, and then when I said I was confused and panicked for about 6 or 9 months, you sort of spent some days thinking, oh yeah, okay, maybe they've got a point, maybe if we just tinker with the incentives and change the commissioning models and redraw the regions, then it'll all be okay. And then you spend other moments going, this is just crazy where we've ended up, where everyone's running around competing for outcome payments, shoving people into any job, whether it's suitable, because you can't pay your staff and run your service. And we got 5 or 10 people all doing the same thing in a region in a Hunger Games style consulting model. So you kind of live between these two realities. But we concluded we need a fundamental rebuild. It shouldn't be controversial to say that full privatisation has failed, which is something we said, because even the Liberals, who love to outsource anything they can get their hands on, even they concluded in their previous term of government in the establishment of Workforce Australia that the largest share of the caseload would be brought back in-house to be overseen by the public sector through the digital online services. And that's indeed a reform direction which every country is going in, whatever the degree of marketisation and contestability and service partners, that it's cheaper and more efficient and more sensible to help those people closest to the labour market and activate them, whatever language you want to use, run by the public sector. So it shouldn't be controversial. Some days it is. We concluded that we no longer have a functioning national coherent employment service system. We've got an inefficient outsourced Centrelink compliance management system with some terrific people working throughout it that sometimes get people a job despite all of the barriers in their way. So it is a 648-page report, don't be scared. I'm just going to give you a quick headline summary of the case for the prosecution, if you like, the sort of flaws that we found, the key recommendations, and then seed the discussion around future of public services. So some of the summary of flaws and issues. It doesn't work for long-term unemployed people. The data's clear. We've got a red-hot labour market, yet the system has not prepared too many people on the long-term unemployment caseload for the jobs that are around now. Yes, human capital, yes, training, but so much of it's been driven by trying to meet points targets and mutual obligation requirements, because otherwise you get your payment cut off, rather than actually rationally investing in something that may benefit the person in front of you to get a job that's realistic in the labour market. Look, I think the figures probably understates it, but the previous review found that only 4% of employers anymore use the system. 4% use the public employment service system. Now, it's probably a bit more than that. I actually think that's probably an underestimate for a range of reasons. But even, double it, triple it. You're talking, you're lucky to get to sort of fingers and toes, if we're counting percentages, of people who use the public employment service system. Like I said, it's reasonably efficient for those closest to the labour market, but structurally, long-term unemployment just slowly kept growing, and the labour market economists said it's structurally higher than you would have predicted under the previous kind of public models. Second point I'd make is around mutual obligations. The Robodebt Royal Commission found that fraud in the welfare system is, to quote the Royal Commissioner Catherine Holmes, minuscule. The way we've applied mutual obligations, I'm not saying the existence of participation requirements, whatever you want to call them, every system in the developed world has some kind of participation requirements, and it's an inherently political question, stemmed from the 17 and 1800s with Victorian laws and the problem of the unemployed, as the language used to be. But the way they've been applied is like using a nuclear bomb to kill a mosquito. If you actually look at what we've done to the system, it is tied up in red tape. Verging on 50% of a provider's time now is spent on policing mutual obligations, typing crap into the computer for Centrelink, and dealing with the inefficient IT and administration. I mean, that's just mad. The frontline services are burdened and being drowned in red tape, and we had metrics around that. That's driving employers away, but it's also making many people less employable by requiring them to do things which either actively harm them, the constant mental health impacts of being rejected, being forced to apply for jobs that you know you're not going to get, forced to do training courses that tell 50-year-olds with a work history to get out of bed on time. I mean, all of those things can have a place and can have benefit, but the way they've been applied and the universality and the one-size-fits-all approach has actually not helped. We've designed the system, if you like, around the worst people in society and the worst providers, and everyone else gets lumped into that paradigm. Supply and demand, as I said, this flawed theory that if we only focus on supply ever more and somehow beat unemployed people ever harder, they'll magically get a job. The system should be about better connecting supply with demand, about both creating jobs, whether that's entry-level jobs through public contracts, social procurement, obligations and so on, or actually working with employers. Fourth issue I'd just note, the destruction of that sense of localism. Social capital's actually a thing. Alison, Julian and I used to write about this. Social capital's a real thing. It's relationships in communities, and it's at the local level that skilled caseworkers, good services actually have relationships with local businesses. I'll come to the market design flaws in a moment that mitigate against that. As well, the Commonwealth has no view on quality or a service model. One of the most impactful moments with the excellent bureaucrats, they're very skilled at what they do and what they've been asked to do, was we had all of them lined up. We had deputy secretaries and the secretary and first assistant secretaries and some assistant secretaries and this kind of whole phalanx in that giant room, the big committee room. It's all very serious. And I said, could someone explain to me what's a good service model? Could you just step me through? And we had the gaping fish. And the long awkward silence where everyone kind of goes, oh God, who's going to take that one? And someone made a valiant effort and said, well, we don't really have a view about the service model. We manage by KPIs and outcomes and stuff. That, as we concluded, is a genuine problem, that the Commonwealth has no view on what a quality service is or how you run an employment service anymore. Competition. Look, the way that competition has been applied, we concluded, is a problem. And if you go to any town centre, I represent, Dandenong, most multicultural place in Australia, one of the most socioeconomically disadvantaged municipalities. Go to any regional centre, Shepparton, Wodonga, we went to regional Australia. Pretty much every street corner, you'll find an employment service provider, because we've got this theory of competition that's no one's questioned, that you need 4 or 5 providers doing largely the same thing, plus a bunch of DES providers, disability employment service, plus a transition to work youth provider. From employers' perspective, this is just crazy. Like, who are all these people? It's fragmented, there's no coherence to the service system, they're all knocking on their door desperate to try and chase an outcome payment. No wonder they disconnect. And so the fragmentation there is an inherent part of the design based on a flawed theory of competition. In 22% of the regions, we went to Cairns for example, but 22% of the regions, last tendering round, lost 100% of their providers. So all of the relationships with employers, all of the relationships with clients, bang, gone in the tendering round. You've got a whole new crop of people coming in. So it's an inherent problem in the market design. My 2 favourite paragraphs in the report are paragraph 2.94 and paragraph 2.49, strangely. Paragraph 2.94 makes the point that there's kind of 4 things that you really need to be confident on if you want to keep operating this massive quasi-market system with no direct government involvement. You've got to understand that a fair chunk of your money will go on profit and surplus. Fair enough. It's nothing that you're not for profit, you're not for loss. So a bit of what you spend will go on that. The tendering costs run to hundreds of millions every round. So you've got to be confident you're going to get better value for money and better quality and so on out of the other end, because you're literally standing on the oval throwing away hundreds of millions of dollars of cash on tendering costs and lawyers and probity consultants and bids, and the taxpayer ultimately pays for every lease that closes and every new computer system that gets bought and all the new signs and logos. So it's hundreds of millions of dollars every round, as the OECD says. But then you've got an army managing the interface. Most of the public servants manage contracts and KPIs, and you've got significant proportion, about 20-30%, I think, don't hold me to the figure, of staff in the entities that do administration and contract management and quality management and reporting. So you've got to be confident with those 4 cost items that you're going to get better value for money from running this quasi-market than you would by changing the level of competition or bringing some stuff back in-house. I just also make the point with that kind of competition point that the theory of lots of competition and marketisation will get great innovation and great quality, and it'll all be cool because everyone will compete and they'll specialise. The reality is, as every country that's operated a quasi-market like this, and I'm labouring this point because it's got a broader point for human services at the other end, every country that's run a quasi-market like this quickly or slowly figures out that government has to heavily regulate and prescribe the quasi-market because otherwise people profiteer grossly. So in the first round, even Howard figured this out pretty quickly. You had people going a contract going, oh, this is pretty good. I just kind of won't employ many staff and I don't really care if I don't meet any KPIs because look, I made $17 million. I won't get another contract, but I made $17 million. So you actually have to heavily regulate. The point we've got to now is the department issues, a 600-page manual that largely codifies and standardises and prescribes what people do. It limits innovation, and then the Hunger Games contracting model means everyone lives in fear of losing their contract, so they all largely do the same thing. They'll put different face on it, they'll get a bit of different service model, but they converge at the same point. There's very little overperformance and excellence. There's relatively little awful performance. Most of them cluster within a median band. So you kind of scratch your head and go, well, where are the benefits of all this competition and choice from the Hunger Games model? Final couple of things I just note as problems. The workforce, it's a deprofessionalised, deunionised, female-dominated, low-paid workforce. Oh, another one of those. With a 40% annual churn, we've seen. 40%. If as you and I were talking, you did a PhD in this. Yep, 40% annual churn. The most important factor, if you had to pick one, to get a vulnerable or long-term unemployed person back connected with the labour market is a trusted relationship with a skilled case manager. Like, if you had to pick one, how on earth can you do that when you're deunionised, deprofessionalised, and you've got 5 case managers in a year? You can't be vulnerable, you can't build trust, and it just doesn't work. The final thing I'd just note, for people furthest from the labour market, I won't labour the point, we could talk about it if you like, every human society has a cohort of people who are not meeting the threshold for a disability pension, whatever the society calls it, but everyone knows they're not going to compete in the private labour market, at least permanently. They might have episodic mental illness, they might have caring responsibilities, they might have some of the other structural barriers that we talked about. In old-fashioned terms, they may be just not quite right. They're the people who, most days they're good and then they come into our electorate office and randomly scream at people. They're not bad people. We just need to think about how we care for and include people like that rather than expecting them to somehow do things which they're not going to be able to do. So the summary of the recommendations are we need a stronger public sector core to the system. We've suggested calling that Employment Services Australia. It'd provide the stewardship and the enabling functions for the system to work in regions and also for that online case management. Heresy, I know, in the sort of neoliberal market orthodoxy, we've also said that there should be some modest elements of direct service delivery by the Commonwealth Public Service, not for reasons of cost or efficiency, but so we get some skin in the game again and rediscover what delivering employment services is like and recreate that loop between service delivery and policy development that, good theory, any public policy school will say you need. Second area for reform would be mutual obligations and compliance. Compliance and mutual obligations will be part of the system, but they should operate in the background, not be the first thought that everyone goes to. There's a whole bunch of stuff, and that's paragraph 2.49, which I might touch on in a sec, about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivations. But we've said we need to broaden and tailor the mutual obligations rather than one size fits all, and not ask people to do things which will harm them or reduce their chances of getting a job, but ask them to do things which are in line with their goals, aspirations, capabilities and their individual plan. We've also said quite clearly that the ability to impact a person's social security payment should only be made by a public servant. It shouldn't be automated and it shouldn't be outsourced, just as a matter of kind of ethics and base public administration. We said that we need to better connect the supply and demand, which means focusing on employers as well. We need a sort of a single front door, hide the wiring, if you like, for employers to overcome this fragmentation problem that's driving them away. And things like entry-level jobs, social procurement. We said clearly we need to dial back the level of competition and blow up, change the sort of regional structure and the market structure. What we've suggested is a larger number of smaller regions. The current regions are giant. They're drawn not to reflect regional labour markets, they're drawn to reflect this theory of Commonwealth procurement and ease of Commonwealth procurement, that you need a certain number of providers of a certain scale to be efficient, and therefore we draw the region that large. They're disconnected from employers, from councils, from chambers of commerce, from industry groups, people who actually have social capital to get people into work. So we've said redraw the boundaries based on actual regional labour markets. Look at one mainstream provider per place with a very different commissioning model and market culture. If you take the OH&S example, I think Mark Considine gave me this in one of our discussions. If you take the OH&S regulatory culture, the inspector comes in and looks at the building, and there's a few things if they see, you shut down. You know, if there's water dripping into the light, you shut down till it's fixed. Someone might die. But most things in an OH&S inspection become areas that you work on for quality improvement between the regulator and the service partner. They're not reasons to say, we've scored you, you're going to lose your contract, you die now, we'll get someone else. Like, you actually have a partnership model to improving in place. So if you've got a stronger public sector core that helps people steward in a region, that does better assessment, that streams people, and I think the analogy I used was, you use a GP to navigate the health system. You don't try and figure out which specialist and which diagnostic test you need. You go to your navigator, your GP dating agent. I think the Minister was talking about if you go to an emergency department in a hospital, you don't give everyone the same operation and the same prescription, which too often is what we do now. So the public sector can do that stewarding and actually stream people, do proper, deeper assessment. And then you've got a richer ecosystem of providers and options for people in place. You might have a mainstream provider, the obvious specialist providers are called, this is what the evidence says, you probably need a culturally and linguistically diverse provider. You definitely need a standalone youth service, different pedagogy, different way of engaging in services, different issues with aspiration and so on. You need disability services, which are there, whatever model you put them in. Definitely Indigenous services. We've quoted the Productivity Commission's work that Aboriginal community-controlled organisations are going to get better results overall. So we've given a strong rec there. But also ex-offender services, which are just dreadful. So that's a state and territory Commonwealth issue that we said needs a standalone service. We've also given a really big push towards social enterprise, because for some people, social enterprise, for those furthest from the labour market, may be their journey back to the labour market. For others, it's their destination, and that's okay. So there's a range of recommendations we've given there. We can talk about it. If I'd wrap that up by saying, our argument is we need to build a public sector capability at the core. That doesn't mean doing most of the case management, but it does mean knowing about case management and doing a bit of it. And it means the stewardship enabling functions in each region. It's a shift in philosophy from contracting everything out to contracting service partners in, which frankly is how most other human service areas actually work. This has become a weird outlier. If you think about health, education, vocational training, even parts of aged care, we didn't fully marketise everything. You've got a rich ecosystem of private, not-for-profit specialist services sitting around a public core to the system. And that's our argument, that we need to move back to that kind of model. Workforce, as I said, the single most important factor. We said unashamedly we need to re-professionalise. So I can touch on that if people are interested. The last couple of sort of headline recs. If you look at our spend as compared to the OECD, Australia in aggregate spends about half the OECD average on employment services, writ large. If you disaggregate that, we spend more than the OECD average on the operating core of the system. But we spend a fraction of the OECD average on active labour market programs, paid internships, workplace-based training. Now, I know this is controversial with some of our ACTU friends at times, but our argument is that we've got to, yes, human capital's important, yeah, TAFE courses have a role, but the evidence internationally is clear that for people furthest from the labour market, training based in workplaces, training by employers, is more effective to reintegrate someone and give them a go. That raises a whole lot of issues. Yes, some people won't work out. I get that. And yes, you've got to deal with integrity and cheating the system, but it is a significant shift in how we should be thinking about investing through active labour market programs. So our argument very, very clearly is it's much better to pay an employer, provided the integrity things are managed, to give someone a go and put wraparound support and training in, whatever the wraparound support needed. Ultimately, that's a better investment for society than what we're currently doing, or just leaving people on unemployment benefits. So we shouldn't be scared to invest more money in well-designed programs there, which frankly I think is what your government did with Working Nation, and there's a lot to commend with some of those program designs. Not a lot new in this space, it's a bit back to the future. The very final thing is an independent regulator, and pretty much everyone agreed with that for all sorts of different reasons. Our proposal, but government will work it through, is that we need an independent regulator to set workforce standards, to set a view about quality frameworks and what a quality service should be, to take on that continuous learning function. I've got no time for this view of, that some providers have put, well, that's my IP, I'm not sharing my secret sauce. Basically, if you want to take taxpayer money to deliver these kind of services, you should be required to share your learnings, whether it's community of practice through the regulator, across the system, otherwise don't play. We have to find a way to share learnings across the system and what good practice is. Advising on pricing and funding, and also a complaints management function independent of providers in the department. So they could sit, we think, in a regulator. You can design it in different ways. Final couple of things in terms of next steps. Some people within government have said, look, this is an excellent report, we're looking at it, but why is it so bloody long? I said, well, two things. One, if you want to get your head around it, read the chair's summary, the chair's forward, it's an excellent forward, I might say, and read the 1 or 2 page chapter summaries at the start of each chapter. That's all you need to read to get the gist of the report. But the primary audience for this, multiple audiences, the primary audience is actually the Commonwealth Public Service. I just want to read you 2 paragraphs to emphasise that point. Most people would be familiar with Terry Moran, who's been banging on about the need for reform in this area for years and years. I caught up with him a few times. I won't verbal him further, but let me read this paragraph. Numerous experts, academics, former senior public servants and practitioners have cautioned the committee that the biggest obstacle to system reform is likely to be entrenched resistance, even hostility, in parts of the Australian public service, given a decades-long belief in full marketisation, a lack of experience in service delivery, and the sheer convenience of being able to blame contractors for systemic failures. As outlined in the report, successive governments and senior bureaucrats have remained detached from the messy reality of communities, regional labour markets and service delivery. As with other privatisations, bureaucrats and politicians avoided direct responsibility for systemic failures and public discontent by blaming contracted providers. The shift proposed in this report is significant, and challenging orthodoxy brings risk, but change is essential as the current system simply does not and cannot work. And I hope that they're chewing on it well, but a big part of the reason we wrote such a comprehensive report is to take every possible argument, every piece of evidence we got, dissect it and put a view. There's very few loose ends or loose threads that were left from the evidence. They're in there, we'll see what they make of it. The final point I'd make, and this is for all of us in terms of sort of going forward with this topic, paragraph 16.6, central to any serious effort to reform the system and improve outcomes for long-term unemployed and disadvantaged Australians will be a fundamental change in both political and community attitudes to unemployed people and recipients of income support. Most Australians want to work. Most Australians do not cheat the system. Those who do cheat the system or are otherwise persistently or deliberately non-compliant should be dealt with via social security compliance mechanisms. But it's absolutely critical that everyone's not lumped into that paradigm. And I go on to quote the Royal Commissioners from Robodebt, that very evocative paragraph there where she makes that point in relation to Robodebt. So look, the final thing to set the discussion, that's employment services as best I could sort of do a 648-page report in about 25 minutes. Some of the interesting things that come out of that for those public sector policy nerds like me and others in the room I know, what are the implications more broadly for public sector, public service reform? Chapter 2, if you're a public sector nerd, read Chapter 2. It's the case for the prosecution or the critique and analysis. It's a direct challenge or punch in the head to some of the neoliberal orthodoxy that we've now had for 20 to 30 years and new public management theories and quasi-market models. New public management levers absolutely have a place, but we've overused them. That's effectively where we landed, and they've gone well beyond their limits. Targets, choice and competition, quasi-market regulation, they've got a place. But we've really challenged the orthodoxy on outsourcing and said government has to be smarter about how and when the private sector or the not-for-profits are engaged or contracted in, not contracted out, and challenge this view that's built up. It's an ideology the Libs preach, that the private sector is always somehow magically cheaper or more efficient or more effective. The evidence is really clear. That's simply not always true. There are things. Absolutely you can contract out, you can buy in expertise. There's commercial expertise and other sorts of things you don't have or will go stale in the public sector. But we really need to have skin in the game as one of our conclusions, and that's a lesson across a whole range of other areas. Core public sector service capability and having a view on service models and what you're commissioning. To put it in plain terms, if you think about in state governments got themselves for a while without any in-house rail engineering expertise or too little, how do you know if you're buying $100 million of crap or not if you're not an informed smart customer, and how do you remain an informed smart customer if you don't have some in-house capability? So it's an issue and a question right across government. If you had to pick one, I'd probably say ICT is still the biggest issue with that at the moment. Cheap and efficient, and I'll end here. Cheap and efficient, though, are not the only measures that we should be thinking about in this discussion more broadly. Quality public services are a sign of a civilised society, and they need great skilled public servants to deliver them. Doesn't mean doing every activity, but that shouldn't be a controversial statement. And the language of cheap and efficient seems to have become, for too long, the dominant thing. It's the only thing which we value or talk about. And the Finance Department absolutely has a role to play in maintaining discipline, but they shouldn't be specifying what we're trying to buy. Society should also be asking what is good, what is right, what is fair, what is needed for business and people. And they're values-based questions which are in the realm of the political. So, circle back to where I started. It's a serious bit of work. Yes, it has a narrow application in relation to employment services, but I think there's some broader conversations and things for the labour movement as a whole about our view about public sector capability and public sector service delivery and how we kind of get that balance right. So I'll end there and happy to sort of have a chat or take some questions. Thanks, Emma. Sure.
Okay, who's going first?
Paul Divney from Prosper, Julian,
Yep.
submitted something to you about employer engagement and the lack of in this
Yep.
Speak up a little bit, please.
Sorry, yeah. I'm curious about the disability employment contract that's coming up for tender shortly and what influence your report will have on the shaping of that.
Hang on, we're reconnected? Good.
Yeah.
What influence may this report have on disability employment service matters? Look, a very short answer. Technically, DES was out of scope, so we deliberately wrote it out of scope. We also deliberately wrote CDP, the remote Aboriginal, largely Indigenous kind of employment programs, out of scope because they're run separately. We had some observations about the intersection and possible future reform changes, but not firm recommendations. So the narrow answer is Minister Ishworth is proceeding with her DES reform processes independently. I think there's a very clear view right across government, including reflected in our report, but also executive government, that disability specialist providers are essential and need to remain part of the system. Some can express a view, and we've given a bit of nod in that direction, that they could be wrapped in under a rebuilt stewardship enabling function, an assessment kind of function and so on. That's probably my instinctive view. But I wouldn't expect that could happen anytime quickly. So, talk to DSS and Amanda about where the DES reform process is going.
Julian, thanks so much for your talk and for your work, and particularly for your comments about the importance of relationships and combining training with work experience. Can I ask you a cheeky question?
Sure.
Why should those public servants be Commonwealth? What about
Yeah.
states? And did you look about the different labour programs by the different levels of government?
Yeah, okay, good question. Why should those functions be Commonwealth driven, not state? and how do the state and territory labour market programs intersect. We did meet, and I ensured that we met with every state and territory government, but whether formally or as a sort of a bilateral meeting. Each of those was like being on a different planet. That's no disrespect. Some of that is actually sensible because they've adapted to their context. I would say New South Wales was the strangest after 10 years of Liberal government. I talked about place-based disadvantage and what are you doing about long-term unemployment, and it was like I was talking, ancient Swahili or something. It was just, there was no remnant of that kind of policy thinking in their bureaucracy. That's not having to go at them. They did some things that they were tasked to do well. But the first point I'd make there is there's such a diversity of approaches from state and territory governments. Most of it is driven by a view of the skills training system and what business needs, skills shortages, industry development and so on. Some states, Victoria is probably a prime example, great legacy I know from your work and others many years ago, but some states still have a focus on place-based entrenched disadvantage. I think that's a good thing. So where we landed on that was a couple of things. This has to be Commonwealth driven. The Commonwealth, for no other reason, if no other reason, pays the welfare bill and has all of the right incentives to keep people activated, and that's a legitimate objective. It just shouldn't be the sole objective. And the history of state and territory agreements in this kind of space, I think, if we want to get central agencies on board, I think there'd be rightful scepticism about your ability to get into bed with state governments and have those kind of agreements last the test of time. Right now, there's a pretty big conversation going on around the NDIA reform with states and territories. I can guess the reaction if I'd served up a report that said what we need to do is get into bed with state and territory governments on all of the Commonwealth Employment Services. So what we've tried to do instead is propose a regional model that has state and territory governance as part of the regional governance, but is something that they can buy into where they choose to as a co-partner. So we put a recommendation in about Jobs Victoria, for instance. Their place-based work is terrific. There's no reason, we've said the Commonwealth should actually look at partnering with Jobs Victoria and with the Tasmanian Government's Jobs and Skills Hubs as early examples of how this stuff could work. So state governments can buy in at the regional level, but we shied away from a notion that it could or should be devolved.
Yes, thanks, Julian. Rob Gordon's my name. I joined the Alpha branch of Labor after Goss dismissal, and in the late 70s, a nice man came from head office and explained the wonders of privatisation.
All right.
And there's been no mandate. It's a brain-dead, failed ideology. And what's wrong with the CES that was working perfectly?
Yeah. So privatisation and what's wrong with the CES, because it was working perfectly. That's the distillation. I'm repeating it for those listening at home. So look, I think your average Australian is not buying the ideology of privatisation anymore. I think it's been overdone. So you got no disagreement from the report there. We also had a good look at the submissions that said recreate the CES, and there were a number of them. I think there's a lot of rose-coloured glasses going on because I think the historical record would contest the view that the CES was working perfectly. But we're also trying to work out what would you propose and design in this era. We have got recommendations in there about bringing Seek and LinkedIn and the digital jobs marketplaces into the employment ecosystem. Frankly, most people look for their jobs online these days. There's no such thing really as an old board where you go and look at the card. They used to have those little white cards. So we're trying to think about how you design an efficient and effective employment service system in this era. And our conclusion was not to recreate a giant monolithic bureaucracy as first point. The second point I'd make though is people for 25 years that have done periodic reviews on this system have not questioned the fundamentals. We've tinkered with the incentives and changed the commissioning, but we haven't questioned the fundamentals. Everyone said, oh well, we can't unscramble the omelette. I think what we're saying, our view is for the next few years, we need to rebuild a public sector core to the system, and we need to start to reassess and change how we do it. Frankly, if I stood up today and said, oh, let's recreate the CES, no one could do it. There's no institutional capability. So even if that was your goal, and I'm not the committee's concluded that that isn't the best way to go, but even if that was your goal, you couldn't do it right now. You'd have to rebuild a core, but all of the service provision is sitting outside in private and not-for-profits. You can't just, it's just not a realistic thing to do. But our conclusion was that that's not the right answer in any event.
I don't know your name. Yes, hi, I'm Jenny Crosby. I'm from the Centre for Social Impact at Swinburne University. I was interested in your comment about young people and the need for a fundamentally different system for them.
Yep.
Can you give a bit more information about your thinking about what sort of place-based services might be put in place for?
Yeah, we sketched, so the question is about young people and place-based services. We sketched out in the report, and our recommendation was that there be a standalone specialist youth service, one in each place. We use the language of place as distinct from region, just to be clear. So the current commissioning model for the flagship youth service Transition to Work is one per place. But a region may have 2, 3 or more places. So we think that's so I'll just make that distinction. The Transition to Work model is really good. It's pretty effective, gets a good rap on evaluation and from providers and communities, but it's for people who are pretty disadvantaged and it's expensive. Okay, so it gets pretty good results, but it's for people, you know, up that end of the spectrum. For everyone else who might just need a little bit of help, they're in mainstream service provision. So our view was, having visited a lot of the youth hubs, youth employment, you know, old-fashioned stuff in communities that might get a bit of Commonwealth money, a bit of state money, a bit of local money, but do good things, was that hub model, that sort of integrated service, seemed to be most effective, and that we should be trying to move things in that direction. But ultimately it's about choice. So if someone, a young person, needs help getting a job, is on unemployment benefits, you know, you're on unemployment benefits off usually not because you need help getting a job, but just because you're poor, because you need some income support till you get another job. But if a young person needs that kind of help, they can go in, they can do the assessment, they can be presented with options. The preferred or default option might be the Youth Employment Service, but that might not be the best service for them. They could still choose to go to the mainstream provider. They may be better off with a called specialist service. They may be a young Indigenous kid better off with an Indigenous Aboriginal community controlled organisation. If they've got a mild intellectual disability, their best option may be a social enterprise down the road. But you should be able to pick those options and have them be your mutual obligations, rather than sort of, you know, I go to the social enterprise, I go to the Brotherhood of St Lawrence's program, but I've got to keep going to this provider every 2 weeks to tick off points. So I can't kind of do it justice, the complexity of what we've said, but does that give you a bit of a feel for it? So we'd wrap Transition to Work in, but there's a lot of young people who don't need anywhere near that level of help or investment. Yep.
I've got a question from the online.
Sure. Yeah, let's do online.
I'll lean in. This is from Stephen Torsey at the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation. He's asked online, did the committee consider the impact of fiscal, I think primarily monetary policy on the labour market, and whether and how employment services might play the role of an automatic stabiliser? I think that might mean a job guarantee during downturns.
We had a look at that issue of frictional unemployment and so on in the theory part of it. And we've given a nod to a greater role for government, which I touched on in my remarks, for example, around direct job creation, entry-level jobs, but particularly social procurement. That's something which really stood out when we had a look at the Denmark, the Netherlands, a range of other countries. Because Australia's chosen to outsource most of the kind of entry-level jobs that are government serviced done, particularly through local councils, what other countries can do by just saying, oh, well, 10% of the workforce, they negotiate it with the unions, 10% of the workforce in our parks and gardens or our rubbish or our home care or, you know, looking after Meals on Wheels at the office or council staff, they're going to be unemployed people, and that's just kind of part of the social contract. We don't do that because everything's outsourced. So if we want to do that, it has to be through social procurement mechanisms. We do a bit on Indigenous procurement, but our suggestion is we can broaden that. So back to the kind of point. No, we haven't. We didn't get that explicit, but I think you could thread some of our recommendations back to a recognition that when unemployment, you know, rises or falls, governments may need to develop more active labour market programs to respond to those kind of circumstances and not be scared of doing so.
Thank you. Great.
Julian, look, thank you for this and your very encouraging work and contribution. Listening to you speak was like hearing an account of the dismantling of the home and community care system that we experienced a year ago. The Morrison government torpedoed block funding, local government walked, and your description of an outsourced labour churn, unskilling the workforce, all those things apply there. So my question is there an appetite in Parliament to wind back this assault on community services that we've experienced for the last 10 years?
Yeah, I think across the Labor caucus there's a scepticism about the extent of outsourcing, or about what I talked about before, this ideology that somehow privatisation will always deliver better outcomes, cheaper and so on. A lot of the services though that are kind of you're talking about there are actually council delivered. When I was Mayor of Port Phillip about 1,000 years ago, I think 2000 or something ridiculous, we had the Jeff Kennett compulsory or competitive tendering. We made a very clear policy decision to protect human services. We had to comply with the law, and so we focused on tendering parks, gardens, rubbish and so on, road maintenance, because we felt that those core human services, childcare and home care, with that human-to-human relationship, were too important to protect. About half of the Victorian councils have got out of that now. I would make the point that the federal government's extended the program. We've extended last year the program through to 27-28. So, message to any council, there is no reason, you can't blame the federal government for choosing to exit that service. That's a values-based choice that people can make. I've seen it in my electorate. The City of Casey exited the service a year ago. It hasn't worked, and I've got some pretty strong views on Greater Dandenong at the moment. I think the council's going to do the right thing and not do that at the moment. I don't know what else I can say, because a lot of those things are not really directly federal government responsibilities.
The question was the appetite in Parliament to wind back. It's not just home and community care, it's not just CS. This ideology is permeated in many places. Are we prepared to wind it back more comprehensively? Yeah,
well, I've telegraphed my view on employment services, which says yes, and I've tried to make the point that there are lessons from that. If you want to nerd out on it, have a look at paragraph 2.94. It's a table from a paper that was released that Terry Moran sent me, actually, from effectively UK Labor think tank last year. You could take any of those kind of lessons from there and apply them more broadly to an argument around outsourcing and community services.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Julie, just some sense of the timelines. We've talked about the great plan, but what does the timeline look like?
I don't know. It's a matter for executive government. In the normal way of things, you'd expect normally you get a response in about 6 months to parliamentary reports, right? We've suggested that some things are more urgent, some of the mutual obligations changes, investing to fix the messy IT system which is killing productivity. So there's a range of things we've said, look, you just got to get on and do that. There's some things which we've said then are short term, but they're about setting up system reform. You've got to sit down and develop a new view around regulatory culture and commissioning and so on, and probably regulator and things like that. A lot of it's medium term though, because of how the contracts are locked in. So I'm completely relaxed if government takes longer than normal to chew on it, because it's a really big piece of policy thinking, and people who've worked around government knows that ministers can't just decide these things. They go through really complex ERC processes, discussions like this. So I'm sure that's happening at the moment. Maybe we'll get a bit of a hint in budget, but if you look at the contracts and the work orders and so on, it drifts into a second term agenda. That would not. There's no great state secret in saying that.
I shouldn't mess it up.
Last
question. Speak up a little, Kimberly, please.
Kimberly Wheeler from the Melbourne branch. Thanks for your talk today. I'm just wondering, with regard to the different scopes that you're talking about to address the needs of different groups in the community, has there been any consideration given to arts workers who do sporadic kind of work in their field, like actors and musicians, and that kind of seasonal, I guess, kind of work, and how to address that for those workers?
Yeah, largely no, because most of that drifts into the social security system settings, which were outside our terms of reference, and with a couple of exceptions, we sort of shied away from. The couple of exceptions or observations I'd make, we did make some sort of recommendations, whether they're appreciated or not, around aspects of the disability support pension and disincentives to work. One of the primary disincentives for people to take work is actually the loss of the healthcare card. And the government, it's actually not the taper rates, which Dutton was on about, there's little evidence of that, but anecdotal, common sense, door knocking, talking to people at the front line. Take a single mum, they're very, I'll get back to the art scene, I'm not avoiding it. People are very rational at making the best choices to optimise their family's income. And for many people, if you've got 2 kids and you're living as a single mum, you do the sums, you'd be mad to lose the last dollar of the sole parent payment because you lose the concession card, which is worth real money, and it's also a psychological safety net. What if my kids get sick? All that kind of stuff. So the government did the right thing, I think, in the employment white paper and has extended essentially a 6-month, 26 weeks, something like that, period where you can earn 0 income but still keep the healthcare card. So that's a bit of a direction of reform which will help some episodic kind of workers and give people more confidence to take part-time work and drift back in and out. The example, and you might, if you want to advocate around that, have a look at, there was some words in there around seasonal work. It really struck me, being up in Darwin and Cairns, that the social security system has not properly adapted to the seasonal realities of Northern Australia. So basically, it's wet and it's dry. And a vast chunk of the hours available in the labour market simply disappear when it rains. Whether it's road maintenance or construction or tourism or defence operations or defence logistics supporting operations, those hours simply don't exist, they just disappear. So people then make really bad choices, but quite rational choices, to not report their income because otherwise they lose their card, and they're working as much as they can, but it's just the nature of the economy there. Similarly in some seasonal kind of harvest work. So I think there's a broader point around how the social security system intersects and interacts with people in episodic work, but it's not something which was core to our report, but you might want to leverage off some of that analysis we did.
All right, that's all we have time for.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
I got the sense we could have kept going all afternoon then, and obviously we'll be monitoring the progress of the government's response to the report. As I said, I have read the whole thing, so if you want a quick summary from someone, give me a call. No, don't, I haven't got time. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you again, Julian, for a really fascinating look at the work you and the committee have done. And important to note, I think, that what Julian managed to achieve is unusual in committee reports, which is that it was a cross-partisan, most of the recommendations were cross-partisan, and I think that needs to be called out and congratulated, because we don't see that very often, so congratulations. We will be back in 4 weeks' time here at Graduate House on the 20th of March, and our guest speaker will be Cameron Murray, talking about his new book, The Great Housing Hijack. So that will be through the lens of our Centre for Equitable Housing. Please do stay in touch with us. We've got a big agenda this year. We are, as the papers got excited about yesterday, apparently we're in an election year. All that means is there's an election sometime in the next 18 months or so. Doesn't mean it's going to be this year, and I hope it isn't, because we've got a lot to do. So please stay in touch. I hope to see some of you who've joined us for the first time come back. We'd love to see you next month. We always have a really interesting range of speakers, and we're here on the third Wednesday of the month. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.